When I was a kid, my dad would frequently take me to Menards.
Save big money at Menards.
Before the arthritis, he was a woodworker and was constantly going on runs for materials and assorted tools. On one of these fateful trips when I was around 6 years old, we were walking by a rack of DVDs that were all priced at $5, and one of the DVDs was a combo pack of Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla and Godzilla vs. Destroyah. I immediately grabbed it and begged my dad to buy it for me. He obliged, and I remember that 20-minute drive home feeling like a cross-country road trip. Finally getting home and putting that movie into the DVD player and watching Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla for the first time was a core memory for me. This was my introduction to the Heisei movies outside of my brief exposure to them in Cinemassacre's Godzillathon. So I really do think that it was the perfect introduction to this era for me as a young kid. You had Little Godzilla bringing the cute factor. You had a terrifying villain with SpaceGodzilla, which, side note, my introduction to SpaceGodzilla outside of this movie was in the Wii game Godzilla Unleashed, where the campaign had him as the final boss, and I vividly remember losing my mind at how badass the concept of a Space Godzilla sounded.
It can't be! Space Godzilla!
But even beyond that, this movie has it all. You have a robot being piloted by humans that could separate into a tank and a jet like a combiner transformer. And of course, you had the king of the monsters himself, Godzilla. It was the perfect mix of science fiction with fantasy. Mothra's there, so we'll say it's fantasy. As well as just kaiju cinema being presented in a really accessible way. At least, that's how I felt years ago. I'm now a 23-year-old man, and it seems like nowadays, in the year of our Lord, technically 2026, I'm filming this in 2025, December, doesn't matter. It just seems like Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla is often regarded as being the worst film in the entire 90s era of Godzilla. I've even seen some people on social media outright say it's one of the worst entries in the series' 70-plus year history. And outside of Zeth from J&Z Productions, I haven't seen this one being listed as a favorite in the franchise by really anyone. If you want a specific idea of just how hated this movie, and by extension its antagonist SpaceGodzilla really is, just look at what one fan had to say upon hearing the news that SpaceGodzilla might appear in the next MonsterVerse entry, Godzilla x Kong Supernova. Here's their entire post, unabridged. Quote, SpaceGodzilla, the B-list villain of all time. His design is based on Godzilla's powered-up form in a Super Famicom game. His debut film was so uninspired it made the special effects director and Godzilla suit actor both realize they were about done with the franchise. His defining character trait is hating kids. He was the face of a US toy line several years before we could legally watch his film. His ghost possessed Godzilla in a TV show where all the monsters were portrayed by vinyl figures. He was the main villain in two fondly remembered fighting games from the 2000s. His Magic the Gathering card had to be reprinted with a different name because his signature weapon is the Corona Beam, and it was released in the spring of 2020. He's going to be the first Toho Kaiju not named Godzilla, Mothra, King Ghidorah, Mechagodzilla, or Rodan to have a major role in a feature film in over 20 years. Beyond the shade that was thrown at Godzilla Island, which, by the way, that show is peak, the reputation surrounding SpaceGodzilla and this movie as a whole has always baffled me, but I think it's still important to consider the stranglehold it has in the fandom, especially in the context of this retrospective. Why does it seem like so many Godzilla fans feel this way? What differentiates it from the rest of the 90s Godzilla movies? I want to try and find the answers to these questions while giving the movie a fair shake. Obviously, there's going to be some inherent bias given the nostalgia that I have for this movie, but like every movie I cover on this channel, I need to be as open-minded as humanly possible. First, let's start at the beginning. When Toho entered production on Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla, the company was deep into a run of films that were marked by connected storylines, more consistent world building, and increasingly elaborate visual effects. After 1993's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Toho sought a new antagonist that would feel powerful enough to challenge Godzilla, yet distinct from previous mechanical or revived foes. Early brainstorming reportedly toyed with reviving King Ghidorah as Emperor Ghidorah, or introducing a new Mechagodzilla variant, but the creative team ultimately pursued a more cosmic direction. The result was Astrogodzilla, who would later be reworked into SpaceGodzilla, a genetic offshoot created when Godzilla's cells drifted into space, either via Biollante spores or attached to Mothra after Godzilla vs. Mothra. The creators emphasized a design that would feel familiar yet alien, echoing Godzilla's silhouette but with crystalline growths, telekinetic abilities, and an otherworldly presence. Kenpachiro Satsuma returned to portray Godzilla, donning a new suit which was a slightly modified version of the previous film's design. The film introduced a mechanical counter-Godzilla unit, abbreviated to Mogira, a redesign of the 1957 robot from the Mysterians. Released in Japan in December 1994, Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla was met with mixed critical reception. However, like the majority of Godzilla movies, it never received a wide theatrical release here in the US. Instead, the first official US release came years later via direct-to-home video. This was in January of 1999, 6 years after its theatrical release in Japan. It was released by Columbia TriStar Home Entertainment, and they recorded an English dub for international audiences, and that was the dub that ended up on my Menards DVD copy.
Save big money at Menards.
As flawed as Godzilla dubs usually are, I found this one to be pretty solid, all things considered. It gets the job done, and it isn't distractingly bad like some of the ones from the Showa era. Regardless, now I want to try to answer the question: is this the worst Godzilla movie of all time? One of the best? Or somewhere in the middle? Let's find out. This is Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla. Godzilla's cells, cast into space by Biollante and Mothra, mutate under black hole radiation and create SpaceGodzilla, a crystal-armored extraterrestrial that descends to Earth. Landing on Bass Island, it overwhelms Godzilla, imprisons Little Godzilla in a crystal cage, and heads for Japan. There, SpaceGodzilla erects a massive crystal fortress in Fukuoka, siphoning planetary energy through Fukuoka Tower and threatening global destruction. Mogira attacks, but is outmatched until it splits into its two components to weaken the fortress. Godzilla topples the tower, cuts off SpaceGodzilla's power, and ultimately annihilates the alien monster with a supercharged atomic blast, freeing Little Godzilla. Revenge sits at the center of this film, and for me, it all crystallizes around the grizzled and angry Major Akira Yuki. I do not read him as a side character or a narrative detour necessary to have a human character shoved in the mix. I read him as the emotional spine of the entire movie. Every major conflict bends around his obsession, and every escalation traces back to a single unresolved wound: the death of Goro Gondo. From the moment Yuki steps onto Bass Island, the story stops being about strategy or science, and it becomes a movie that's about personal grievance overpowering judgment. I see his yearning for revenge as being deliberately narrow and self-destructive. He does not want balance, he does not want safety, he wants one thing, and that's Godzilla being dead. He wants to be the one who pulls the trigger. The blood coagulant bullet matters less as a weapon and more a symbol than anything. It represents his belief that Godzilla can be reduced to a weak point if he studies the monster hard enough.
He's got a weak zone, a place on his body that he can't protect, right here. That's where I'm gonna aim that bullet.
Revenge convinces him that pain can be solved with precision. I never get the sense that Yuki is fighting for humanity as a whole. There is no selflessness in his actions. He is fighting for one man who never got to walk away from the battlefield. What makes this theme hit harder for me is how the film constantly places revenge next to responsibility, and it lets the contrast speak for itself. The character of Miki moves through the story burdened by fear and empathy as opposed to the hatred that consumes Yuki. Her arc bends towards protection and restraint, while Yuki's arc bends towards fixation. Watching these two philosophies collide on Bass Island feels very intentional. I do not see Project T as the real moral conflict of the film. I see Yuki's presence there as the true danger. His minds hurt Little Godzilla. His impatience nearly sabotages the mission. Revenge keeps spilling outward, catching innocent targets along the way. Usually in these sort of movies, when the enemy monster shows up, the themes kind of go by the wayside and we just focus on monster destruction. But the arrival of SpaceGodzilla really only sharpens this theme instead of replacing it, because SpaceGodzilla does not need revenge. It does not grieve. It simply consumes. While the cosmos is throwing something far worse at Earth, Yuki still cannot let go of his private war for the sake of humanity. Even when SpaceGodzilla imprisons Little Godzilla and turns Fukuoka into a crystal graveyard, Yuki reroutes Mogira away from the real threat to chase Godzilla. This is the film's way of showing revenge narrowing his vision until he cannot see the larger catastrophe unfolding in front of him.
Now heading towards Godzilla.
What is Yuki doing?
All units, change course.
I read Yuki's turning point as being deeply ironic. He never abandons revenge because he forgives Godzilla or finds peace, but he abandons it because reality finally proves him wrong. Godzilla survives every attempt on his life and still chooses to fight Godzilla. The monster Yuki defined entirely by destruction ends up saving the planet. And in that moment, it strips him of his justification for revenge. Yuki is left with nothing but the damage he almost caused. When he stays behind in the wreckage of Mogira and sends Koji and Kyo to safety, I read it as the first selfless act he makes in the entire film, and maybe from his perspective, in his entire life.
Abandon ship.
You too.
Never mind me.
Revenge has burned itself out, leaving only responsibility in its place, and the ending reinforces this reading for me, because Yuki, obviously, does not get the kill he wanted. He does not get the catharsis through violence. Instead, he gets survival, humility, and a limp. Now, that's at least my analysis of the human story, flaws and all, but does it actually work and function in its execution? Kinda, sorta. As a whole, I think this movie features some downright incredible ideas that are hampered by incredibly dumb ideas. For every neat concept, there's either a dumb concept or poor execution weighing it down in some way that's in the screenplay or in the principal photography itself.
Dude, I'm totally tripping balls. I'm totally tripping balls.
First things first, the special effects in Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla are very rough. I'd go as far as to say that they are among the weakest in this entire run of films. The reported budget sat around $10 million, which it's hard to find exact budget numbers for some of these movies, but that seems to be the general consensus. Mind you, $10 million isn't pocket change, and that makes the end result even harder to defend. A year later, Gamera Guardian of the Universe comes out with roughly half the money and absolutely runs circles around this film in terms of effects work. Watching those two back to back is really embarrassing for Toho. Within the context of the 90s Godzilla movies, this feels like scraping the bottom of the barrel, especially when you remember how sharp and inventive something like Godzilla vs. Biollante looked just a few years earlier. The flying effects are really where things start to fall apart. This has been a recurring problem throughout the 90s era of Godzilla, going back to Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and it never fully gets solved here. Wire work and compositing clash in a way that constantly pulls me out of the movie. You can see the ambition, but you can also see every seam holding it together. I do want to give credit where it's due because the suits themselves are largely excellent. Godzilla looks fantastic, SpaceGodzilla looks imposing, and Mogira is an absolute standout. The lone exception for me is Little Godzilla. I've never been a fan of this redesign. The big eyes and green skin push him too far into cute mascot territory. He feels less like a believable juvenile Godzilla and more like a chibi Sleestack from Land of the Lost. I really miss the baby Godzilla look from Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, which struck a better balance between vulnerability and continuity with Godzilla's design. Mogira, though, is a triumph. This version feels like the perfect evolution of the character introduced in the Mysterians. The silver and blue color scheme gives it a real industrial feel, and the metallic sheen sells the idea that this thing is actually built from steel and machinery. Every time Mogira is on screen, the movie suddenly feels more confident and more focused. SpaceGodzilla's design also works far better than the execution around it. The Biollante-inspired cheek teeth, I think that's what you'd call them. Maybe they're mandibles, but these little things here. I love the crown, I love the shoulder crystals. I think it establishes him perfectly as something otherworldly. He reads as this cosmic reflection of Godzilla without drifting into parody. The crystal motif, especially the idea of him constructing a fortress in the middle of a city, should have been one of the great visual set pieces of the era. You can see flashes of that potential in the way buildings are torn apart and reshaped when the crystals burst out of the ground, but the rushed production undercuts the impact. Instead of feeling grand and ominous, parts of it just come off as being cheap and undercooked. Godzilla himself looks phenomenal, aside from the moment where his tail accidentally falls off while they were filming, and that somehow made it into the final cut of the movie. But regardless, I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it here. This is the definitive Godzilla design for me. When I picture the character, this is the iteration that pops into my head. Marketing and toy lines definitely reinforce that image, but the design holds up on its own. The proportions feel perfect, the face can read as cruel or compassionate depending on the scene or the movie, and this incarnation supports Godzilla as a villain, a force of nature, or, as in this film, a straight-up hero. A lot of other Godzilla designs lock him into one emotional register. This one doesn't, and that flexibility is why it works just so damn well. Now feels like the right moment to talk about how Godzilla is written in this movie and how that ties into the larger Heisei era. I'll be honest, taken as one continuous storyline, this era has some of the weakest characterization that Godzilla has ever had. His role shifts depending on what each individual film needs from him. Viewed in isolation, that approach can work fine. Let's say if it's King of the Monsters Godzilla from 2019 to -1, where they're not canon with each other, there's no continuity. That works, I don't mind that. But when you actually connect these movies, and you start to zoom out and treat this entire era like one single narrative, Godzilla drifts between villain, anti-hero, and outright hero with very little connective tissue holding those shifts together. A lot of that instability traces back to 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. That film throws the entire era off balance and sends it down a strange path where continuity and character motivation feel secondary to big ideas and spectacle. The dip in quality and originality after that point is really hard to ignore. Still, I'll throw out a hot take here. Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla actually does some real course correction. His son is kidnapped. So, I get it. He wants revenge. He wants to go after the big bad. It's understandable motivation, and it fits within the franchise's history. Godzilla softening after becoming a father isn't anything new. Son of Godzilla did that all the way back in 1967, and it marked a major turning point during the Showa era. This raises a bigger question for me, though. Does this count as good writing? I'm still torn, because framing Godzilla as a parent on a rescue mission kind of strips away some of his autonomy. The story pushes him into a revenge framework where he mirrors Yuki, both driven by personal loss toward a specific target. Part of me resists that, because Godzilla has always worked best as a character who chooses his own path, even when his choices are destructive or morally unclear. He needs to have agency. That was my problem with the Hanna-Barbera Godzilla series, because he kind of just does whatever the humans want him to do. And to me, that's just not Godzilla. At the same time, revenge stories are some of the most enduring narratives in all of cinema. Kill Bill, Old Boy, Once Upon a Time in the West, and even the Shakespeare classic Hamlet all hinge on characters responding to personal harm. Those protagonists never feel hollow or passive. They still act with purpose because the decision to pursue revenge belongs to them, even when the outcome feels inevitable, because if there wasn't revenge, there wouldn't be a story. The tension comes from how far they're willing to go, not whether they'll go at all. For me, that's where my conflict with SpaceGodzilla sits. Godzilla's agency feels reduced on paper, but the revenge structure arguably makes agency less important here. The emotional drive is very clear, the motivation is very grounded, and the narrative never tries to pretend there's some other choice on the table for Godzilla. So, I don't know. I keep going back and forth on whether that weakens Godzilla as a character or if it simply places him in a different storytelling mode. Either way, the movie at least tries to give his actions meaning, and within the messiness of the Heisei era, it's abundantly clear that effort stands out.
But why Earth?
It's here to kill Godzilla.
I think one of the biggest highlights of this entire movie is in the human cast, and that is the character of Miki. For the first time in this entire run of films, the series actually commits to her as a participant in the story as opposed to just being a background character. Throughout most of this era, she's been sidelined into an almost ceremonial role. She shows up to meetings, expresses concern for Godzilla, and exists largely to soften the tone of otherwise militaristic conversations. The scripts rarely allow her to influence events in a tangible way, which is a shame because she has so much potential, and she's such a great actress. It's like, give her more to do. Come on! Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla finally breaks that pattern. Miki's psychic abilities are treated as a functional part of the narrative, and not just another symbolic flourish. Her perspective directly informs decisions, and her emotional connection actually matters for once. Her presence pushes scenes forward instead of stalling them. Viewed on its own, this feels like a long overdue correction. Miki comes across as capable and relevant to the story, and the human side feels less like an obligation and more like a parallel thread that's actually worth following for once. Looking at the broader Heisei era, the timing is really hard to ignore. This is the second to last entry, and only now does the franchise fully embrace what the character could and should have been from the start. After years of unuse, giving her real narrative purpose this late feels less like a triumph and more like a reminder of how much potential was left on the table with these movies. Now I want to take a minute to talk about the sound design, because this is one area where Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla absolutely nails it. The standout moments almost always involve Mogira in combat. Every beam, missile, and weapon cue sounds gloriously old school.
Continuous fire.
The effects feel so punchy and they carry a sense of force that modern sound design often sands down. SpaceGodzilla benefits from the same level of care because his vocalizations don't feel like a recycled Godzilla roar with a filter slapped on top. The sound team clearly wanted him to feel separate and threatening in his own way, and I think that choice really pays off. Even Little Godzilla gets attention here. His sounds lean very cute. It fits the character, but they still retain an animal edge that keeps him from slipping into cartoon territory. And the music, oh my god, it's so good! Oh! It's doing so much heavy lifting. Takayuki Hattori's score is phenomenal, and it's easy to forget how strong his work is here because Akira Ifukube always looms so large over the franchise. Hattori embraces scale and emotion in a way that feels almost operatic.
What you listening to, son?
I don't think you like it.
Well, why not? I like this new generation of music.
The SpaceGodzilla theme carries this ominous cosmic menace that fits the character perfectly, blending sci-fi dread and a sense of grandeur. The Mogira theme, by contrast, feels very rigid and militaristic, built around structure and precision, which makes total sense for the role that Machine plays in the story. Look, Akira Ifukube will always be the backbone of Godzilla's musical identity. You hear dun 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 dun, you think Godzilla. Or bum 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 bum. That's Godzilla. There will be Godzilla movies 100 years from now that will be compared to Akira Ifukube in the musical department. His influence is impossible to escape no matter who sits behind the orchestra. Still, Takayuki Hattori earns real credit here. His score stands shoulder to shoulder with the best Ifukube work in the series. I said it. I would argue it represents the strongest contribution that Hattori would ever make to the franchise. Of course, he would go on to later score the anime trilogy and Godzilla 2000, but looking at this movie specifically, I just think it gives it a level of texture and personality that the visuals sometimes struggle to match, and that contrast ends up being one of its greatest strengths. Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla ends up standing apart from the rest of this era in a way that I don't think gets talked about much. A big reason for that comes down to how overtly video game coded the whole movie feels. The entire third act revolves around a very clear objective. Godzilla and Mogira have to target and destroy SpaceGodzilla's shoulder crystals and the tower in order to weaken him. The structure is very blunt and it's oddly satisfying. I feel like I'm literally just watching a boss fight play out in real time. Some people have criticized this, saying that it feels very cheap, but I think that approach actually lines up nicely with Godzilla's history. Late Showa films frequently pulled inspiration from whatever media their young audience was engaging with at the time. Godzilla vs. Gigan leaned heavily into manga culture, right down to centering its human story around a comic artist. Godzilla vs. Megalon openly borrowed from tokusatsu superhero television, especially shows like Ultraman, with Jet Jaguar functioning as a direct reflection of that influence. SpaceGodzilla feels like the natural continuation of that tradition, filtered through early 90s and mid-90s gaming culture. The video game influence also isn't accidental when you consider that the prototype version of SpaceGodzilla was in Super Godzilla, the video game. Seeing that DNA carry over into the film makes a lot of sense, especially during an era when Godzilla games were becoming a major part of how younger fans interacted with the franchise. Like I said, my introduction to SpaceGodzilla was in Godzilla Unleashed. SpaceGodzilla played a huge presence in those Pipeworks games, and I think this is why. The movie plays like a cinematic extension of that video game mindset, complete with weak points, escalating attacks, and a very clear win condition. Look, I get the criticism for this. I think the video game logic can feel heavy-handed a little bit, and there are moments where the movie leans too hard into mechanical plotting. Even then, though, the concept mostly works for me. It gives the final act a sense of real coherence and momentum, and it embraces a playful sensibility that had always been a part of Godzilla's identity. Stepping back, I land on this being a solid middle-tier entry in the franchise. It never approaches the highs of the Heisei era at its best, but it also avoids outright failures like Godzilla vs. Mothra. The real frustration comes from seeing how many good ideas are present and realizing how many of them get undercut by Toho's rigid production schedule. The annual release pipeline forces ambition to compete with deadlines, and Godzilla vs. SpaceGodzilla wears those compromises on its sleeve. What's left is a movie full of very interesting concepts that rarely get the time or the resources that they need to fully click. And with all of that out of the way, I am Cole McCormick. You are watching Firewood Media. This is just one small part of my massive Godzilla retrospective project where I revisit and review every single Godzilla movie and TV show. Thank you so much to the channel members for supporting this channel. Your names are listed right up here on screen. For $1.99 a month, you can get early access to select videos, plus members-only content, and even see your name featured in the credits of our original films and videos, just like this. It's an easy way to help keep these retrospectives and short films going, but whether you join or not, I appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.